April 18, 1942. The Pacific wind howled across the open deck of the USS Hornet, cutting through the roar of engines and the metallic clatter of bomb bay doors. The sea was rough, white-capped waves rising and falling beneath the gray hulls of two American carriers pushing through hostile waters. Rain misted across the flight deck as 16 twin-engine B-25 Mitchell bombers stood lined up, their olive-drab bodies glistening with salt. Each pilot knew the truth. This mission wasn't meant to return home. The runway ahead, less than 500 feet, was designed for lightweight fighters, not bombers meant for continental airfields. Yet one by one, crews strapped in, tightened their harnesses, and waited for the signal. At 8:20 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle climbed into his cockpit, his eyes locked forward, calm, precise, relentless. Behind him, sailors held their breath as the deck pitched again. Then came the green flag. Throttle full, propellers screamed. The bomber lunged forward, wheels barely clearing the edge of the carrier before vanishing into gray ocean spray. In that instant, America's fight back had begun. Not with victory, but with vengeance. Born from the ashes of Pearl Harbor. Just 4 months earlier, on December 7, 1941, the Empire of Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. In less than 2 hours, the U.S. Pacific Fleet was left smoldering. 8 battleships damaged or sunk, more than 2,400 Americans killed, and a nation shocked into war. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces expanded with stunning speed, seizing the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and sweeping deep into Southeast Asia. Tokyo's military command believed it had achieved strategic perfection. The Americans, demoralized and wounded, would negotiate peace before striking back. But they misjudged the American spirit. The United States was wounded, yes, but not broken. President Franklin D. Roosevelt demanded a response, not months later, but immediately. America needed to hit back, not just for strategy, but for morale. The people needed proof that Japan was not invincible, that their cities were not untouchable. In Washington, a daring idea emerged, one that military experts called impossible. Launch Army bombers from an aircraft carrier, strike the Japanese mainland, and somehow escape to China. The mission was bold to the point of madness. No bomber that size had ever taken off from a carrier before. The distance from the nearest friendly base was beyond the plane's maximum range, and once over Japan, there would be no way back. The crews would have to ditch or crash land somewhere in occupied China. Yet in this impossibility lay its genius. The Japanese military had convinced itself that its homeland was beyond reach. Tokyo's air defenses were minimal, radar coverage nearly non-existent, and civilian awareness of danger practically zero. A single attack, even symbolic, could shatter that illusion and deliver a psychological blow far greater than the physical damage itself. The man chosen to make it happen was James Harold Doolittle, an aviation legend long before the war. He was a scientist, racer, and test pilot, a man who had broken speed records and pioneered instrument flying. Doolittle was daring but not reckless. When he received the order to lead the mission, he didn't hesitate. His only concern was feasibility. Could a medium bomber take off from a carrier deck loaded with bombs and extra fuel? Could his men survive? The Army Air Forces and the Navy began secret collaboration in January 1942. At Eglin Field in Florida, volunteer crews from the 17th Bomb Group trained under absolute secrecy. They practiced short takeoffs, flying low-level approaches and simulated bombing runs over mock cities. Their aircraft, the B-25B Mitchell, was modified for the mission. Stripped of unnecessary weight, fitted with extra fuel tanks, and equipped with special bomb racks. Even the top turret guns were replaced with broomsticks painted black to deceive enemy fighters into thinking they were armed. Meanwhile, the Navy prepared its carrier, the USS Hornet, for an unprecedented voyage. 16 bombers would be loaded onto her deck, their wings folded tight. The crews would depart from the coast of California, escorted by the USS Enterprise and a fleet of destroyers and cruisers. Their objective? Reach a launch point roughly 450 miles from Japan, strike Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya, then continue west to China. Every man aboard understood the stakes. If detected early, they could be attacked by enemy patrols long before reaching launch distance. If the weather turned, the bombers might never get off the deck. And even if everything went perfectly, fuel would run dry long before safety. Yet, morale was high. After months of defeat, this mission represented something far greater than a tactical strike. It was America's statement of resolve. On April 2, 1942, the task force departed San Francisco under total radio silence. The Pacific stretched endlessly before them, cold, gray, and unforgiving. Hidden beneath the calm waves, Japanese submarines prowled. Above, reconnaissance planes searched the skies. The risk of exposure grew with every hour. By April 17th, after 2 weeks at sea, the task force reached the edge of Japan's defensive perimeter. The plan was to launch the following morning, April 18th, when they would be just close enough for the bombers to reach China. But at dawn, everything changed. At 7:38 a.m. on April 18, 1942, the calm surface of the Pacific was shattered by an urgent radio call. A Japanese picket boat, the Nito Maru, had spotted the U.S. task force, still nearly 650 miles from Japan. The ship's crew transmitted an alert to Tokyo before being destroyed by American gunfire. The element of surprise, so vital to the mission's success, was now slipping away. Doolittle and Admiral William Halsey, commanding the task force, faced an agonizing decision. The plan had been to launch at 450 miles. Now they were more than 200 miles farther out. That meant the bombers would have to fly longer, burn more fuel, and almost certainly run out before reaching China. Doolittle didn't hesitate. He looked at his men, pilots, gunners, engineers, and gave the order, launch immediately. His reasoning was simple. The mission could still succeed in its purpose, even if they never made it back. "We'll hit them," he reportedly said, "and make them remember." The first B-25, Doolittle's own, roared down the pitching deck of the USS Hornet. The wind was strong, waves crashing against the bow, but the plane lifted off after less than 500 feet of runway. One by one, 15 more bombers followed, each clearing the edge of the carrier with just feet to spare before dipping toward the sea and rising again into the gray sky. It was a sight few aboard the Hornet would ever forget. Massive bombers lumbering into the air from a ship never meant to launch them. Sailors cheered as each plane lifted off, knowing they might never see those men again. Once airborne, the crews formed into loose formations, maintaining radio silence as they headed northwest toward Japan. Below them stretched the endless expanse of the Pacific, 1,000 miles of open water offering no forgiveness for error. Hours passed. At around noon, the Japanese mainland appeared through the haze, a sight no American combat pilot had ever seen. Doolittle's plane led the first group over Tokyo, flying barely 1,500 feet above rooftops. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire almost instantly, shells bursting in black puffs around the bombers. But the Japanese response was confused. They hadn't imagined an attack could come from the east. Their defenses were oriented toward potential threats from the Soviet Union or the South. Civilian sirens wailed as American planes swooped over the capital. Each bomber carried 4 500-pound bombs, 2 high explosive and 2 incendiary. Doolittle's crew released theirs over industrial targets in Tokyo, steelworks, power plants, and military storage depots. Others struck Yokohama's docks, Kobe's factories, and Osaka's shipyards. Flames erupted across multiple cities. Damage was limited compared to the massive firebombing that would come later in the war, but the psychological impact was enormous. For the first time, Japanese civilians realized that their empire, which had stretched outward unchecked, was not invulnerable. The entire raid lasted barely an hour. Then the bombers turned west, heading toward China. For many crews, that's when the real test began. Strong headwinds slowed progress. Fuel gauges dropped rapidly. Radio contact was impossible. Some planes, realizing they would never make landfall, jettisoned guns and gear to lighten their load. By nightfall, heavy rain and fog covered the Chinese coast. The bombers flew on instruments, exhausted, hungry, and nearly out of fuel. One by one, they made the same grim decision to bail out or crash land in darkness. Of the 16 bombers, 15 made it to China. One, too far north, landed in the Soviet Union, where its crew was interned. The others came down in scattered, desperate conditions. Some crews parachuted into rice fields, others into mountains or rivers. Chinese villagers, risking their lives under Japanese occupation, rescued many of them, but not all were so lucky. 8 men were captured by Japanese forces, and 3 were executed. 1 died in captivity. Yet remarkably, Doolittle himself survived, parachuting into a field and later being found by friendly Chinese forces. When he finally reconnected with his men days later, Doolittle assumed he would be court-martialed. In his mind, the mission had failed. Every aircraft lost, several men missing or dead, and minimal physical damage inflicted. But when news of the raid reached the United States, the reaction was explosive. Newspapers called it revenge for Pearl Harbor. Crowds cheered in the streets. Roosevelt famously told reporters, the attack had been launched from Shangri-La, a mythical place, a deliberate deception to confuse the Japanese about how it had been done. The Doolittle raid had achieved something far greater than its tactical goal. It had restored American morale. It proved to every soldier, sailor, and citizen that the United States could strike back, and that the Pacific War was far from over. But in Tokyo, the reaction was far different. Shock turned to rage. The Japanese High Command demanded answers. How could American bombers have reached their skies undetected? How had their defenses failed so completely? And from that question would come a decision that changed the entire course of the war. For the Japanese High Command, the Doolittle raid was more than an embarrassment. It was an existential wound. Until that moment, the Imperial Japanese Navy had projected an aura of invincibility. Their war machine had swept through the Pacific and Southeast Asia with unstoppable momentum, from the Philippines to Malaya, from Hong Kong to the Dutch East Indies. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had crushed America's Pacific Fleet, and Tokyo's propaganda assured the Japanese people that the empire was protected by its divine wind, the kamikaze spirit of national destiny and natural barriers of the Pacific. But when the smoke cleared over Tokyo that April afternoon, everything changed. The illusion of safety was shattered. The emperor himself had been placed at risk. The first angle to understand the Doolittle raid's impact is psychological warfare. The physical destruction was minor, a handful of factories damaged, a few dozen casualties, but the psychological shock was seismic. For the first time in over 2 millennia, Japan's home islands had been attacked by a foreign power. The Japanese people, who had been told they were untouchable, suddenly realized the enemy could reach them. Panic rippled through Tokyo. Citizens began evacuating key areas. Civil defense drills were ordered. For the Imperial General Headquarters, it was humiliation in its purest form. Their enemies had done what they themselves had always feared, struck at the heart. The second angle is strategic reaction. Within weeks, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet and the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, proposed a bold plan. He understood that the Doolittle raid itself was not the real danger. The danger was what it revealed: that American carriers could operate close enough to Japan to launch attacks. If left unchecked, that capability would only grow. Yamamoto concluded that the only way to protect Japan was to destroy the U.S. carrier force once and for all. That decision set into motion the planning for the Battle of Midway, an operation intended to lure America's remaining carriers into a trap. Yet Yamamoto's reasoning, though logical from a tactical perspective, was driven by emotion and political pressure. The Doolittle raid had wounded Japan's pride. The military leadership, desperate to show strength to the emperor and the people, demanded an immediate demonstration of power. It was not a move made from strategic patience but from reactive urgency, and that emotional reaction, born of humiliation, would prove fatal just 2 months later. The third angle is technological innovation and risk. The Doolittle raid represented one of the boldest operational gambles in aviation history. Launching twin-engine B-25 Mitchell bombers from an aircraft carrier had never been attempted before. The B-25 was designed for long-range land-based operations, not the short deck of a naval vessel. The entire concept defied logic. Yet through meticulous testing engineering modifications, and pilot training, it became possible. The aircraft were stripped of unnecessary weight. Armor plating, lower gun turrets, and even extra radios were removed. Extra fuel tanks were installed, extending their range to over 2,400 miles. Navigators trained to fly low and evade radar detection. The mission embodied American improvisation and technical daring, a fusion of ingenuity and audacity that foreshadowed the kind of creative warfare the Allies would perfect as the war dragged. On a fourth angle lies in the human experience, the men who volunteered for what many considered a suicide mission. When Doolittle first briefed his crews, he did not hide the risks. They would be flying off a carrier, bombing Japan, and then attempting to reach unoccupied China with uncertain fuel and no rescue plan. Yet not a single man backed out. These were ordinary Americans, mechanics, farmers, clerks, students, suddenly entrusted with a mission that could alter the course of a world war. Their courage was not reckless bravado. It was quiet resolve. Many wrote farewell letters before taking off, leaving them behind on the carrier in case they never returned. That human courage was mirrored by another group, the Chinese civilians who risked everything to save the downed American airmen. Japanese retaliation against Chinese villages suspected of helping the Doolittle flyers was brutal. Tens of thousands of civilians were massacred in Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces during the infamous Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign. Entire towns were destroyed. Yet the Chinese resistance continued to shelter the Americans, guiding them through enemy territory to safety. The Doolittle raid thus became not just an American story but a Chinese tragedy, a reminder that courage and sacrifice often come with devastating cost. Finally, the fifth angle, propaganda and perception. In Washington, the Doolittle raid became a beacon of hope. The American public, still reeling from Pearl Harbor and the loss of the Philippines, suddenly had proof that their forces could strike back. Newspapers printed dramatic headlines: Tokyo bombed, Yank flyers blast heart of Japan. Hollywood quickly adapted the story, and Doolittle himself was promoted to brigadier general upon his return. The operation became a symbol, not of destruction but of determination. In Tokyo, however, the government sought to suppress news of the attack. Censorship limited reports of damage, portraying it as minimal and insisting that all American planes had been shot down. But internally, Japanese leadership knew the truth. Their people's faith in the military had been shaken. Civilian evacuations were ordered in major cities. Air defense resources were redirected from the Pacific Islands to the mainland. And the hunt for America's carriers intensified. The Doolittle raid had turned the psychological tide of the Pacific War. It was the moment when Japan's confidence cracked, and America's confidence began to rise. But the full consequences of that emotional shift were yet to be felt. In the coming weeks, Yamamoto's determination to restore Japan's pride would lead him into the most decisive battle of the Pacific, one that would change the balance of power forever. The sixth angle in understanding the Doolittle raid's profound significance lies in its strategic deception, how a single raid forced Japan to overextend itself and reshuffle its priorities across the Pacific. Before April 1942, Japan's strategy had been carefully calculated. Secure a defensive perimeter stretching from the Aleutians to New Guinea, then consolidate and prepare for any Allied counteroffensive. But the attack on Tokyo shattered that composure. The idea that American carriers could operate so close to the Japanese homeland terrified the military leadership. In response, Japan began diverting ships, aircraft, and resources to fortify the home islands and northern defenses, even constructing new air bases in the Kuril Islands and on Hokkaido. Every plane assigned to defend the skies over Tokyo was a plane not sent to the South Pacific. Every ship kept in Japanese waters weakened their forward reach. Without realizing it, Japan had begun to fight defensively, a psychological shift that marked the first crack in their imperial strategy. The seventh angle is leadership under pressure, embodied in the contrasting figures of James H. Doolittle and Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Doolittle, a scientist and test pilot before the war, represented the new American model of command, analytical yet daring, rooted in reason rather than ego. He was an engineer first, a tactician second, but above all, a man who understood the morale of his men. His raid was not about destruction. It was about signaling resilience. When Doolittle later said, I thought the raid would be my court-martial. He wasn't exaggerating. He fully expected to be punished if his crews were lost. Yet his leadership through humility turned potential failure into legend. Yamamoto, on the other hand, was a man caught between brilliance and duty. A Harvard-educated strategist who had once lived in the United States, he understood America's industrial power better than any of his peers. He had warned Tokyo before Pearl Harbor, "If I am told to fight, I shall run wild for 6 months, but after that I can promise nothing." He was right. The Doolittle raid happened almost exactly 4 months after Pearl Harbor, marking the beginning of Japan's decline and confirming Yamamoto's grim prophecy. The eighth angle, tactical innovation and naval cooperation, revealed just how adaptable the U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces could be when faced with impossible odds. The operation was a logistical marriage between two branches that had never before collaborated on such a mission. The USS Hornet, under Captain Mark Mitcher, carried the bombers, while the USS Enterprise, commanded by Vice Admiral William "Bull" Halsey, provided escort and air cover. Coordination was razor-sharp. 2 carrier task forces, 16 bombers, and dozens of escort ships sailed undetected across 6,500 kilometers of ocean into enemy waters. When they were spotted early by a Japanese picket vessel, the decision to launch the bombers immediately, 170 miles earlier than planned, showcased American adaptability under fire. What could have been a disaster became a symbol of quick, decisive thinking. The Doolittle raid was, in many ways, a rehearsal for the joint air-sea operations that would later define U.S. success in the Pacific, from the Gilbert Islands to Okinawa. The ninth angle revolves around morality and warfare. The Doolittle raid was controversial even among Allied strategists. Bombing cities raised ethical questions that would only grow louder as the war continued. Civilian areas were hit in Tokyo and Yokohama, and while the scale was minuscule compared to later firebombings, it foreshadowed the escalation of total war. A conflict where industrial centers, homes, and morale were all legitimate targets. Yet in 1942, the raid was seen as justified retaliation, a warning to Japan that its own tactics, exemplified by the bombing of Chongqing and the brutality of Nanking, would no longer go unanswered. The moral paradox was evident. To defend civilization, the Allies would have to embrace destruction. It was a lesson the world would wrestle with long after the smoke cleared. The 10th and final angle was the unintended consequences, how the raid directly influenced Japan's fateful decision to attack Midway. In May 1942, at a meeting of Japan's Imperial General Headquarters, Yamamoto insisted that the American carrier threat must be destroyed before it struck again. Despite opposition from other admirals who favored consolidating gains in the South Pacific, Yamamoto prevailed. The result was Operation MI, the invasion of Midway Island, an ambitious plan to lure out and annihilate the U.S. Pacific Fleet. What Yamamoto did not know was that his communications had been cracked by U.S. Navy codebreakers at Station Hypo. By June, Admiral Chester Nimitz was waiting for him with an ambush of his own. The Doolittle raid, born from desperation, had triggered a chain reaction of pride, miscalculation, and fate that would culminate in Japan's most catastrophic defeat. But beyond tactics, beyond strategy, the Doolittle raid carried a symbolic weight that transcended warfare itself. For America, it restored faith in a nation reeling from loss. For Japan, it forced an empire to confront vulnerability. And for the men who flew those 16 bombers, it became a legacy, not of destruction but of defiance. Each aircraft carried only 4 bombs, but their impact was measured not in tons of explosives, but in psychological shockwaves that rippled across oceans. As Doolittle's crews scattered across China, evading capture and praying for rescue, the Japanese military vowed vengeance. Their fury would manifest in the cruel Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign, where civilians paid the price for an attack they had no part in. History remembers the raid as daring, but beneath the glory lay immense human cost. Yet even in tragedy, the raid accomplished its purpose. It forced the Japanese war machine to reveal its weakness: pride. From this point forward, Japan would no longer dictate the pace of the war. The empire that had seemed unstoppable began to bleed strength with every new front. The Doolittle raid was not the turning point itself, but it was the spark that led the world toward it. April 18, 1942, 8:20 a.m. The Pacific horizon lay gray and endless. The Hornet cut through the waves, its deck slick with seawater, as the final checks were made. The wind howled against the fuselage of the first B-25, engines growling with restrained violence. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's bomber rolled forward, lifting into the fog. One by one, the others followed. 16 bombers in total, each carrying 4 500-pound bombs, each crew knowing that once airborne, there would be no return. The ships were too far from friendly territory. The raid would end in China or the sea. It was a mission on faith alone. Hours later, the Japanese coast appeared like a shadow in the haze, a gray shoreline under a pale sky. The pilots flew low under the radar, following rivers, power lines, and train tracks. Civilians looked up in confusion as unfamiliar aircraft passed overhead. Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, all within reach. Doolittle's own bomber was the first to release its payload over Tokyo's industrial district, the bombs whistling downward toward factories producing aircraft components, tanks, and steel. Explosions rippled across the city. Smoke rose in black columns curling through the narrow streets. For the first time, Japanese civilians heard air raid sirens that were not part of a drill. Panic spread as anti-aircraft guns opened fire. In minutes, the raid was over. The damage was limited. About 50 Japanese deaths, 400 injured, several factories and oil tanks destroyed. But the psychological wound was immeasurable. The illusion of safety was gone. For Doolittle's men, the mission was far from finished. With fuel gauges dropping fast, they turned southwest toward China, flying through worsening weather. Rain hammered the windshields, winds buffeted the aircraft, and darkness swallowed the horizon. Each pilot calculated distances by instinct, not instruments. The fuel that was supposed to get them to friendly airfields in China was vanishing, a result of the premature launch after being spotted by Japanese patrol boats earlier that morning. By midnight, one after another, the bombers ran out of fuel. Some crews bailed out over mountains. Others crash-landed in rice fields or along riverbanks. A few were captured. Of the 80 men who took part, 3 were killed during the mission. 8 were captured by Japanese forces, and 4 of those would later be executed after brutal interrogations. Yet even in capture, the men's courage endured. When forced to sign confessions, they refused to condemn their country or their mission. The survivors who made it to China faced new dangers, Japanese reprisals that would devastate entire provinces suspected of aiding them. Tens of thousands of Chinese civilians were killed in retribution campaigns, villages burned and wells poisoned. It was one of the darker aftermaths of an otherwise triumphant operation. Doolittle himself, having bailed out over Chinese territory, believed the raid had failed. Standing in a muddy field surrounded by villagers, he feared court-martial for losing all his planes. But word of the attack reached Washington before he did, and when it did, the mood of the nation transformed overnight. Back in America, newspapers erupted with headlines: Tokyo bombed, Doolittle strikes Japan. The raid was a national catharsis, a shockwave of hope after the humiliation of Pearl Harbor. President Roosevelt announced the attack with calm satisfaction, refusing to say where it had been launched, implying that bombers might have come from Shangri-La, a mythical place, further deepening Japan's confusion. The Japanese high command, meanwhile, was thrown into turmoil. Initial reports of the bombing were censored, but word spread quickly. How could enemy bombers reach the heart of the empire? The Imperial Navy and Army immediately blamed each other for the failure of defense. The Emperor's inner circle demanded answers. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, took personal responsibility, and with it the burden of retaliation. To restore confidence, he proposed a decisive strike that would draw out and annihilate America's remaining carriers. His target: Midway Atoll. The Doolittle raid, though tactically small, had triggered one of the most consequential chain reactions in the Pacific War. Japan's push toward Midway would become the battle that decided the fate of the Pacific. But in the weeks immediately following the raid, Japan's focus shifted inward. Cities were fortified, civil defense drills became daily ritual, military police cracked down on suspected dissent, civilians dug trenches in their gardens. The sense of invincibility, the belief that Japan's divine islands were untouchable, had vanished. The psychological shock was profound. Historian Saburo Ienaga would later write, "It was the day Japan discovered fear. That fear shaped every subsequent decision, from military planning to propaganda." The irony of the Doolittle raid was that it achieved far more through perception than through force. The total tonnage of bombs dropped, barely 16 tons, was insignificant compared to later raids, but the message was enormous. America was not broken. Its fleet still roamed the Pacific. Its men would strike back anywhere, at any cost. The attack also had a deep effect on Allied morale. Across Asia and Europe, nations under Axis domination took it as proof that the tide could and would turn. By May 1942, Doolittle and his surviving men had made it back to Allied lines. They were heroes. For his leadership and bravery, Doolittle received the Medal of Honor from President Roosevelt. The image of the modest test pilot standing in uniform at the White House became a defining symbol of American perseverance. Behind his calm smile, Doolittle admitted he still believed the mission a failure, until Roosevelt leaned toward him and said, "Colonel, you've done more for the morale of this nation than any man since Pearl Harbor." Yet in Tokyo, Yamamoto and his generals were drawing up plans for vengeance. The lesson of April 18th burned in their minds. If America could strike once, it could strike again. They would find the American carriers and destroy them. The Doolittle raid had awakened a sleeping giant. But now it was Japan that would make the next move, unaware that its overconfidence was leading it straight into a trap. In the weeks following the Doolittle raid, Japan's leadership convened in secret chambers thick with tobacco smoke and unease. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat at the head of a long table aboard his flagship, the Yamato, studying maps spread across the polished wood. His face was calm, but his thoughts were storming. He had promised the Emperor that America would never touch Japan's homeland, and yet, in broad daylight, American bombers had flown over Tokyo. He knew what it meant. The Americans were not only resilient, they were inventive, audacious, and determined to fight a long war. To erase the embarrassment and restore Japan's prestige, Yamamoto designed an operation so grand, so certain in its objectives, that it would lure the remaining U.S. carriers into a decisive battle. That operation would be Midway. The Doolittle raid had accelerated Japan's timetable for expansion. The High Command believed America's industrial strength had not yet reached full potential, and Japan's only hope was to crush its fleet before it could. The raid proved the U.S. Navy still had initiative, and that forced Yamamoto's hand. He ordered a complex multi-pronged assault, an attack on the Aleutian Islands to divert attention, and a main thrust toward Midway Atoll, a tiny outpost halfway between Hawaii and Japan that guarded the Central Pacific. There, he planned to trap the U.S. carriers and finish what Pearl Harbor had started. The Japanese would send 4 carriers, the same that had attacked Pearl Harbor, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. It was, in theory, the perfect plan. But Yamamoto didn't know that America had been listening. Unknown to Japan, U.S. Navy cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had broken parts of Japan's naval code, JN-25. They had intercepted messages referring to an operation against a target called AF. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team suspected it meant Midway. To confirm, they devised a clever ruse. They ordered the Midway garrison to send a false message that its freshwater system had failed. Hours later, Japanese intercepts reported that AF is short of water. The deception worked. America now knew where and when the Japanese would strike. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, calm and analytical, made his decision. He would meet Yamamoto's massive fleet head-on, but on American terms. In early June 1942, the trap was set. The Japanese carriers advanced under skies of perfect blue, confident that surprise was theirs. On June 4th, they launched their first wave against Midway's airfields. Bombs thundered across the small atoll, shattering hangars and fuel depots. American defenders scrambled in outdated aircraft, suffering heavy losses. But the defenders' reports, precise and immediate, gave Nimitz exactly what he needed: the location of the Japanese fleet. From far to the east, American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown launched their own waves. The battle that followed was not just a clash of machines, but of intelligence, timing, and nerve. As the Japanese prepared a second strike on Midway, their decks were crowded with armed aircraft and refueling hoses. That was when U.S. dive bombers appeared, unseen until the last moment, diving almost vertically from the sun. In the span of 5 minutes, the course of the Pacific War changed forever. Bombs tore through the decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, igniting fuel and ordnance. Fireballs erupted skyward, consuming planes and crews alike. Within hours, 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers were mortally wounded. Later that afternoon, Hiryu, the last surviving carrier, launched a desperate counterattack, striking Yorktown and crippling her. But the reprisal was brief. American dive bombers found Hiryu soon after and set her ablaze. By nightfall, all 4 Japanese carriers, and the pride of the Imperial Navy, were gone. When Yamamoto received word of the disaster aboard the Yamato, he fell into silence. His perfect plan had turned to ruin. He ordered the fleet to withdraw. The once invincible Japanese carrier force, the same that had brought devastation to Pearl Harbor, was now a smoldering wreck beneath the Pacific waves. And though the Doolittle raid had not directly fought this battle, its shadow loomed over every decision that led to it. It had provoked Japan into rushing its grand offensive, into underestimating American intelligence, and into losing the core of its naval power. The victory at Midway was decisive beyond imagination. The United States lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, but Japan lost the heart of its striking force and its most experienced air crews. The tide of the war had turned. From that moment on, Japan would fight defensively, retreating island by island as American forces advanced westward. The Doolittle raid had been the spark. Midway was the explosion that followed. In the months that came after, American morale soared. The same aircraft carrier Hornet that had launched Doolittle's raiders was now a name spoken with reverence. Across the Pacific, airmen and sailors drew inspiration from the audacity of that first strike on Tokyo, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, boldness could change the course of history. For Japan, however, the lesson was bitter. The home islands had been struck once, and though their defenses were strengthened, the fear lingered. The Doolittle raid had pierced the veil of invulnerability, and from that wound Japan's strategic overreach had bled out. Yamamoto would never recover from the psychological blow. A year later, in April 1943, American codebreakers again intercepted Japanese communications, this time revealing Yamamoto's inspection route in the Solomon Islands. In a twist of fate as poetic as it was brutal, American P-38 fighters ambushed his aircraft over Bougainville and shot it down. The architect of both Pearl Harbor and Midway died in the jungle below, a victim of the same intelligence war that had doomed his fleet. Thus, the Doolittle raid, small and symbolic, had set in motion a chain of events that reshaped the Pacific. From that moment, the balance of power began to tilt. The Americans, once seen as disorganized and demoralized, now stood united under a single resolve: to push forward, to fight, and to never again be taken by surprise. When the last flames of the Doolittle raid's legacy died out over the Pacific, the world beneath those clouds had changed forever. The Japanese Empire, once riding a wave of unstoppable victories, suddenly stood at a crossroads of pride and fear. In Tokyo, the shock of the raid lingered far beyond the physical damage. The attack had been small in scale, only 16 bombers, minimal destruction, but its psychological impact cut deep into the national psyche. The Japanese people, who had been told that their home islands were impenetrable, realized for the first time that war could reach their own skies. For the military leadership, it was a humiliation they could not ignore. Every man in uniform, from naval officers to ground defense commanders, understood what it meant. If American bombers could reach Tokyo, they could reach anywhere. The Imperial Japanese Army intensified defensive measures across the mainland. Anti-aircraft units were reinforced. Radar installations, once deemed unnecessary, became a priority. Air defense zones were expanded around key cities. Every strategic factory, port, and airfield was now guarded more heavily than ever. Yet the fear was not only about bombs, it was about what the bombs represented. The Doolittle raid shattered Japan's illusion of control. It showed that the war they thought they had mastered was far from secure. The raid also deepened Japan's internal divisions between its army and navy. The Imperial Army, responsible for home defense, blamed the Navy for its failure to detect and stop the American carrier that had launched the bombers. The Navy, in turn, accused the Army of being ill-prepared to respond to an emergency. That rivalry, long simmering beneath the surface, now grew into open resentment. While Japan's propaganda machinery broadcast defiance and reassurance, the truth inside military circles was panic masked as pride. They responded by tightening control across Asia. Civilian populations in occupied territories, especially in China, bore the brunt of this anger. In a retaliatory wave of cruelty, Japanese forces launched massive search operations to find downed Doolittle airmen and punish anyone who had helped them. Villages suspected of aiding American flyers were destroyed. Thousands of Chinese civilians were executed. The Doolittle raid, while heroic from an American perspective, unleashed a wave of suffering across eastern China. In the cruel calculus of total war, victory in one corner often meant tragedy in another. For the Americans, however, the psychological reversal was immense. In Washington, the headlines of April 1942 carried an unfamiliar tone, one of triumph. For months, the United States had lived under the shadow of Pearl Harbor, reeling from defeat after defeat across the Pacific. Now, for the first time, the nation had struck back. Newspapers printed images of the B-25 bombers and their daring crews. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, when asked where the bombers had come from, famously replied, "Shangri-La, a mythical place." The mystery only deepened the sense of awe. The raid became a symbol of resilience and ingenuity. It wasn't about the damage done to Tokyo. It was about the message sent to both sides of the ocean. America was not beaten. It was just beginning to fight. Back in the Pacific, morale aboard the U.S. carriers surged. Sailors who had watched the Doolittle planes take off from the pitching deck of the Hornet spoke of it for months. It was the first time many of them felt that the tide could one day turn. Across the American home front, war bonds sold faster, enlistments rose, and industry accelerated. Detroit's factories, Los Angeles' shipyards, and Seattle's aircraft plants echoed with new energy. The Doolittle raid had lit a fire in the American spirit that no amount of Japanese propaganda could extinguish. Yet, while the United States celebrated, the men who had carried out the mission lived with mixed memories. Some had died in crashes or executions. Others endured imprisonment and torture in Japanese captivity. Only a few managed to return home. For them, the raid had been more than a victory. It had been survival against impossible odds. When the surviving raiders were quietly awarded their medals, few outside the military even knew their names. But within the war rooms of Washington and the cockpits of bombers yet to come, their courage became legend. It proved that even in the darkest moments, calculated audacity could shake empires. And far across the ocean, Yamamoto, the man who had once brought war to Pearl Harbor, was already drawing his next move. He believed that to restore Japan's honor, he must destroy the U.S. fleet completely. That belief, rooted in pride and desperation, would lead him to Midway. And there, the consequences of his reaction to the Doolittle raid would unfold in a battle that would decide the fate of the Pacific. In the weeks following the Doolittle raid, Tokyo was cloaked in both silence and fury. Official broadcasts minimized the damage, calling it a minor intrusion. Yet behind closed doors, Japan's leaders were shaken. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo demanded immediate retaliation. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, humiliated that the American carriers had slipped undetected across the Pacific, resolved to restore Japan's prestige through a decisive naval victory. His pride, once disciplined by reason, was now laced with vengeance. He needed a plan that would lure the remaining U.S. aircraft carriers into the open and destroy them all in one crushing blow. From this resolve, the plan for Operation MI, the invasion of Midway Island, was born. It would be Japan's attempt to erase the shame of Doolittle's daring strike and to annihilate the last obstacle standing between them and dominance over the Pacific. But in their drive to redeem national pride, Japan's high command overlooked a vital truth. Emotion had replaced logic. The Doolittle raid had forced them to act rashly. The operation that followed, the Battle of Midway, would not only end Japan's momentum, but turn the tide of the entire Pacific War. In this sense, the Doolittle raid's true power was not in the bombs that fell over Tokyo, but in the chain reaction it ignited, a psychological domino effect that would reshape strategy, morale, and destiny. Yamamoto's insistence on attacking Midway was not purely strategic. It was symbolic. He wanted to strike at a location that would once again put Japan on the offensive, far from home, showing the world that the empire was still unstoppable. Yet even as he planned this grand gamble, American intelligence, now aided by the codebreakers of Station Hypo, was quietly listening. They had already begun to decipher Japanese communications. What Yamamoto did not know was that the Americans would be waiting for him. The Doolittle raid had also reshaped U.S. military doctrine. Until that moment, many in Washington and the Navy doubted whether aircraft carriers could strike deep inland targets. The raid had proven otherwise. It validated the concept of long-range carrier-based projection, the idea that naval air power, not battleships, would decide the future of the Pacific. The United States began to accelerate the construction of new carriers and train pilots with renewed purpose. In less than 2 years, this shift in strategy would unleash overwhelming force upon Japan's defensive perimeter. Every naval aviator who later fought at Coral Sea Midway and the Marianas carried with him the lesson of the Doolittle raid. That boldness, intelligence, and timing could defeat even the mightiest of empires. Meanwhile, on the ground in Japan, the raid's impact continued to ripple through the daily lives of civilians. Air raid drills became routine. Families dug bomb shelters. Blackouts became law. The government ramped up propaganda, portraying the Americans as cowards who attacked civilians. Yet beneath that rhetoric, an uneasy truth lingered. If Tokyo could be bombed once, it could be bombed again. The Japanese citizen, once assured of invincibility, now looked to the sky with quiet dread. The fear of future raids eroded morale in subtle ways, forcing Japan to divert crucial resources toward home defense, resources that could have strengthened their front lines elsewhere. This fear also led to one of the most tragic consequences of the raid, the brutal retaliation in China. Tens of thousands of civilians were massacred in Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces as Japanese troops searched for the downed American pilots. The humanitarian cost of that retribution was staggering, a grim echo of how far Japan's moral compass had tilted under pressure. For the Doolittle raiders themselves, history would take time to recognize their impact. The mission's commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, returned home believing the raid had been a failure, that the loss of all 16 aircraft outweighed the small amount of damage inflicted. But President Roosevelt, the Joint Chiefs, and the American people saw otherwise. Doolittle was promoted 2 ranks to brigadier general and awarded the Medal of Honor. His men became symbols of audacious courage, though they carried the weight of what they'd endured: imprisonment, torture, the deaths of comrades. Many would spend the rest of their lives quietly reflecting on the mission that had defined them. When the war finally ended in 1945, and Japan lay in ruins from the atomic bombings, survivors on both sides could look back and trace the war's decisive turn to one bold April morning. The Doolittle raid had not just lifted American morale or humiliated Japan. It had shifted the psychological balance of the Pacific. It proved that America's reach was longer, its will unbroken, and its future war machine only awakening. The Japanese leadership, in chasing redemption, had rushed into their own undoing at Midway. Thus, the small squadron of bombers that lifted off from the USS Hornet did more than bomb a capital. They set in motion the unraveling of an empire. In the quiet that followed the war, long after the last carrier decks had gone silent and the skies over the Pacific had cleared, historians looked back at the Doolittle raid not as a grand military victory, but as a psychological turning point, a moment when belief itself became a weapon. It was proof that courage, when combined with precision and purpose, could shift the balance of a world at war. 16 bombers, stripped down for range, flown by volunteers who knew they might never return, had done what entire fleets could not. They pierced the myth of Japanese invincibility. The raid did little to cripple Japan's war machine, but it did something far greater. It awakened both nations to the true scale of the struggle ahead. For Japan, it was a shock that shattered certainty. For America, it was a spark that ignited momentum. In the months that followed, factories roared, shipyards blazed with light, and a new kind of warfare, fast, coordinated, and relentless, began to take shape. The world saw that the Americans were not merely fighting back. They were learning, adapting, evolving. The Doolittle raid became the first chapter in a transformation that would carry across the Coral Sea, Midway, and beyond. For Doolittle himself, the mission was never about glory. He once said he expected to be court-martialed if it failed. But history chose otherwise. His raid became a symbol of defiance, a declaration that the United States would not fight this war defensively, but with imagination, daring, and reach. It showed that wars are not only won by firepower, but by the will to act when logic says otherwise. In the end, the Doolittle raid stood as a paradox, a mission born of desperation that became an act of strategic brilliance. Its success lay not in destruction but in inspiration. It reminded both allies and enemies that the spirit of freedom, once provoked, is not easily extinguished. From that moment on, every Japanese admiral, every American pilot, every citizen on either side of the Pacific understood a single, undeniable truth. The Americans were not retreating. They were only beginning to fight.